So, Rob, more decision makers in the buying process, advantage or disadvantage?
It's probably hard to pitch it as one or the other, to be honest. It's more, it's a fact. We see many more decision makers these times, sort of, depending on the size of the company, but the average is just over 4 people involved in each B2B buying process. But in larger companies, it could be over 10, 15. And that has a knock-on effect on the number of engagements that we see kind of happen before a lead or a sale occurs. If we look at the average for really large companies with over 1,000 employees, we sometimes see 70 engagements before there is a lead, and an engagement being an email, a social interaction, or really anything with an employee in that company.
And so that's across different buyers, 17?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's across sort of a suite of different people. And a typical approach could be to split these into your ideal customer profile. So quite often you might want to target, let's say you're selling a sales product like SoPro. You might want to target sales managers, sales directors, CSOs as your primary ICP.
Yeah, sure.
But equally, that other execs, potentially CEOs, CFOs, are interested in the benefits of generating more leads. So that's a secondary target. And at the same time, you've got influencers, like the actual salespeople who are going to benefit from the leads generated, who also you want to equip with the knowledge about SoPro or the solution that you're selling.
Yeah, I suppose that's part of it, isn't it? That you've got like each one of those kind of potential influencers on that decision have got their own personal set of considerations and worries and whatever. And so you're kind of marketing your product to those different personas, I suppose, within that business, and sort of helping to, I always think of it like you're trying to kind of have conversations with people before they enter a room to have their own internal conversations about which service or product they're going to go for. Right? And then if you've provided them with the information that they care about, hopefully you're going to come up as a positive kind of, part of that conversation.
Yeah. And that's exactly the way to think about it. It's about sort of, first off, talking to the people in different scenarios in their own language. CFOs are going to want to see things in financial terms, not just cost savings, but how's this going to contribute towards growth? Whereas, someone in sales, actually, their day-to-day is leads, pitches, proposals, sales. And so flexing that language is really important. But I think the key part, as you mentioned, is giving them the tools they need to take away. Because what happens with these buying committees is not just about more people being involved. It means there's most of the conversations about your product happen when you're not in the room.
Yeah.
And so it's really key to identify a champion. You don't know who that's going to be in advance. But you can guarantee if someone really wants to implement your product, implement your service within the company, they're still going to have to convince those other members of the buying committee. They're still going to have to talk to the CFO in the language the CFO wants to hear. They're still going to need to talk to the CEO. And so giving them the collateral and the tools to do that and to present without them having to internally pitch it is what's needed to close that sale.
Yeah. And it's also just part of awareness, isn't it? Like if you've already kind of been creating touch points for those various other buyers, if that champion then goes to them and says, hey, look, I found this solution that I think we should consider, if something in their head goes, oh, I've heard of them, like that's just, it's classic basic marketing, right? Brand awareness.
100%.
Like you're prepping the floor for that conversation to happen in a more positive light.
100%, yeah. And it's why it's so important to look at conversion as conversion of a company, not as of individuals, because you're much better off taking that broad approach because you don't know who's going to be involved in those conversations. And exactly that, the familiarity side of things breeds authority. And it's a much, much easier conversation for someone to sign off. Yeah, I've heard of SoPro, and actually, I'm really interested in using it.
Yeah. What on the flip side, what do you think happens if you were just to go, the way that things used to work 3-4 years ago, or whatever, you're just kind of going after 1 or 2 people. How do you think that plays out now with all these other decision makers?
It's an interesting one. I think really the way things worked 2 or 3 years ago was actually the same as today. The difference was there was a little bit more autonomy because money was easier to come by, 0 interest rates, and so there were fewer decision makers. But ultimately, particularly in larger companies, there is still multiple decision makers. And realistically, 2 or 3 years ago, there were probably opportunities being left on the table by not taking this approach. And if you look at larger companies selling kind of really big, 100,000, multi-million pounds on ERP systems, for example, then taking this account-based marketing style approach, it's been common for years. It's a really well-trodden path, looking at a company, mapping out the buying committees, and really working out how to get that message across. It's just that now it's become even more important in your initial outreach because there's so much more noise in the market. There's so much more scrutiny over budgets in companies. And it's really just a shift towards best practice rather than a fundamental change in how companies work from a couple of years ago.
Yeah, for sure. So then if you're reaching out to, say you've kind of identified 6, 8 potential kind of influencers on a decision, if you're sort of getting signals back from just a couple of those, do we like double down on those? Or do because I was sort of thinking if you've got what seems to be silence coming from the others, you might start to think, okay, well, we've made a mistake here. We've identified the wrong people. But obviously that might not be the case. They're just not actively kind of responding to your outreach, right?
Absolutely. And it's all about timing and channels. And it's really difficult to attribute any kind of leads to a single channel because it's that conglomerate effect. In that specific example, it's really important to kind of be putting content in front of everyone who you think is potentially interested, potentially involved in this decision for a long time. You might have social campaigns running for 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, because you don't know what's going on internally. And the really important thing is layering on timing, because maybe there are 1 or 2 people who are actively engaging, and great, they're going to be your champions, and being able to engage with them at the time that they're ready to talk to you is important. But definitely you wouldn't want to slow down on sort of the outreach or the display to the rest of the business as well.
Yeah. And how long does a typical kind of outreach sequence last?
It depends really what you class as outreach, because as we've shown a few times, around about 3% of people are ready to buy in any market at any given time. Assuming you've reasonably well targeted your audience, and just by laws of averages, around about 3% of people will be ready when you contact them, which means that obviously 97% of people are not. And a decent chunk of those may not be interested in your product. They may be sorted. But then there's probably another 20 to 30% who are interested, just not right now. So that initial outreach, really the goal is to sort of potentially pique a bit of interest, but really to keep going and keep front of mind. And what that means is slightly different depending on who you're targeting. And for example, influencers, you may take a slightly more social display-led approach where actually they're more likely to have internal conversations than talk directly. But your ICP actually is much more important to keep in touch proactively. If you've had any kind of engagement, then following up on that every couple of months, every quarter is really key. But even if you haven't, highlighting events in the company, congratulations on a new hire or a fundraise, for example, and really just keeping top of mind for those key people. With the secondary part of that being that when you're top of mind, you're much more likely to invite that inbound interest at the point that they are sort of seeking your solution, and then acting on that is really, really important.
Yeah. I suppose that's what I'm sort of trying to get at is the timing of, if they're not in market, as you said, like 97% of people aren't at any given moment. So like how long are you sort of active, waiting for them to come into market and waiting to sort of strike on those signals or whatever? But I suppose it's just an ongoing process, right?
Exactly, and it's where multi-channel is best looked at as kind of an all-encompassing strategy. It's not really outbound. You want to be active essentially forever. Whilst that company remains in scope, in target, part of your ICP, there's no reason to stop that marketing. However, that doesn't mean you're going to email someone every week or every month. It means that there's going to be a sort of a well-thought-out series of emails initially, but a well-thought-out social campaign, display ads that support that, and then moving into a cycle where you're listening to those companies and responding to triggers. And they could be, let's say, first-party intent on your website. It could just be that actually this is a really high-priority company. Haven't contacted them for 3 months. It's probably worth just sending one email, just to keep in touch.
Yeah.
But there, in terms of it's a switch in thinking away from an outreach sequence, which has a defined start, a defined stop, from a sort of an always-on nurturing process to your entire addressable audience.
Rob, thanks very much.
Thank you.